Oh, the captains of Captains Row can sail anything that floats. If it's got a rudder, they can sail it in a puddle. Oh, the captains of Captains Row.
Oh, the captains of Captains Row like to go for an evening stroll. You can hear them coming by the shanties a-humming. Oh, the captains of Captains Row.
Oh, the captains of Captains Row like to get in a boat and row. They sail the ocean 'cause they like the motion. Oh, the captains of Captains Row.
Oh, the captains of Captains Row eat oysters with their toast. They scoop 'em from the bottom and they're happy when they got 'em. Oh, the captains of Captains Row. Oh, the captains of Captains Row can sail anything that floats. If it's got a rudder, they can sail it in a puddle. Oh, the captains of Captains Row. Oh, the captains of Captains Row eat oysters with their toast. They scoop 'em from the bottom and they're happy when they got 'em. Oh, the captains of Captains Row. Oh, the captains of Captains Row can sail anything that floats. If it's got a rudder, they can sail it in a puddle. Oh, the captains of Captains Row.
Well, hi, my name is Pat Salmon, and I'm a Staten Island historian, retired curator of history, and I'm here at the Noble Maritime Collection to talk about the Oystermen of Captains Row. It's a fascinating story, and it evolves totally around the oysters that once inhabited the shoreline of Staten Island and beyond. Even going back to the first residents of Staten Island, the Lenape Indians, they used oysters in all of their rituals, in their meals. They were never possible. And in fact, shell middens have been found throughout Staten Island, and they're still visible in some locations. Even Pearl Street in Manhattan got its name from one of the largest shell middens that was ever found. You know, we see when the Dutch arrived that shells become an important part of their diet as well. They're even using shells, broken shells, to make roadways. They are burning the shell to make sort of a mortar where they would put it into the buildings to hold the stones together. But you know what? It smelled so bad and so many people complained, they finally had to stop doing that. As time went on, we find that oysters became a very important part of the diet and the economy, especially to start with in Manhattan. You could buy all kinds of oysters. You could buy them fried, you could buy them boiled, you could buy them raw and eat them raw. Sometimes, though, in Manhattan, they'd have these sleazy basement bars that were referred to as oyster cellars. And if there was a red balloon hanging from the doorway or something like that, you knew that this was no place to bring your children. It was a location where perhaps ladies of the evening might be found. But anyway, it was an important part of the diet for all New Yorkers. In fact, it was an important part of the diet of people who were poor. They could, for 6 cents, they could go to certain oyster bars in Manhattan and they could have an all-you-can-eat plan. And it was called the Canal Street Plan, actually, and they were greatly enjoyed by the public. It was probably around 1679 that two naturalists from Europe came into the Long Island area. They passed through Staten Island on their way to New Jersey. And they noticed how popular oysters were. They also, realized that they were found in abundance in brackish waters. If you think of like the Kill Van Kull or the Arthur Kill, they are fed by some of the freshwater rivers that come in through New Jersey. And that leads to them meeting the salt water. So you have a brackish water environment, and that is where oysters thrived. In fact, you could find oysters pretty much all around Staten Island, along the Jersey Shore, down to Keyport. You could find them along the shoreline of Brooklyn, going out to Long Island, the Rockaways, of course, up the Hudson, because that's brackish water, going up to Ossining, New York, over to Jamaica Bay. They were all over this area. As a matter of fact, it's believed that in the 1600s, half of the world's oysters were found in what would become the New York Harbor. Now, we all know Ellis Island, Liberty Island. Well, Ellis was known actually at first as Little Oyster Island, while Liberty Island was known as Great Oyster Island. And believe it or not, there was a third high shoal there. It was more of an island back in the 1600s, and it was called Oyster Island. But of course, they've all taken on their new names that we know today. Now, here on Staten Island, by the 1800s, our favorite historians, William T. Davis and Charles W. Lang, inform us that the gathering of oysters was done using just small skiffs or rowboats at places like Mariners Harbor, Tottenville, and off of what we now call Prince's Bay. And it really enhanced the economy. And the industry grew so large that by the 1840s, they needed larger boats. So they started to buy schooners and sloops, and they couldn't use the little skiffs so much. So oystering became a big economic effort on Staten Island. In fact, the oyster industry also allowed for the sail industry to flourish. You needed to have oyster tongs and oyster rakes in order to rake up the oysters from the bottom of the water. You needed hand tools to crack open the little bivalves. So we see that all these little economies are feeding off of this oyster industry. You needed to hire men to man the boats, of course. By 1880, as many as 150 Staten Island families were involved in the oyster industry at Tottenville, Chelsea, and Prince's Bay. In fact, this 150 families gathered about 130,000 bushels of oysters in the 1880s. That is amazing. Now, this does not take into account the oystermen who lived in Mariners Harbor and Port Richmond. By 1886, we see that the oyster industry is actually the #1 industry that is active in Mariners Harbor. One thing that the Kill Van Kull was very important for was the captains would bring the harvested oysters and put them in oyster lay boats, which were just very flat-bottomed boats. And they would let them lay there for several hours. And this way, the oyster would get a fresh drink of water, because from the Raritan Bay, it was much more salty over there. So, but the Kill Van Kull, as I said before, is being fed by these nice freshwater streams that are mixing with the brackish water. So some of the salt is going away, and it was really enhancing their taste and their flavor. So they would lay in the lay oyster boats for, like I said, a few hours. Then they'd be put into a ship, and they would be brought to Manhattan. As a matter of fact, the location was Charles Street and by West 10th Street. At that time, the Hudson River was called the North River, but we know it as the Hudson River today. Now, the Raritan Bay, off of Prince's Bay, became actually the focal point for oyster harvesting. In fact, there was a gentleman farmer on Staten Island by the name of Dr. Samuel Ackerley, who studied all of agriculture, but he particularly focused on oysters. And he noticed in the 1840s that the oystermen were not simply using the rakes to gather the oysters off the bottom. They began to use dredging apparatus, and they were sort of scraping the oyster off of the bottom of the waters, off of places like Prince's Bay. And that really devastated the oyster crop, because they weren't leaving the baby oysters there to grow up. And so the oyster beds were not able to reseed themselves naturally. And it was about this time, a little bit later, that the large schooners from Staten Island started to go down to Virginia, particularly the Chesapeake Bay, and they would buy seed oyster, baby oysters, and they would bring them back and plant them in the Staten Island Sound, which is the southern portion of the Arthur Kill River, or plant them in the Raritan Bay, and they would leave them there to mature and to grow up until they could be harvested and people could eat them. Now, it was a very, very important business. But even as the 1800s is unfolding, we're starting to see that pollution is a really big problem. So first we have overharvesting, and then by the 1880s we're starting to see pollution. We don't think of the 1800s as being a polluted era. We think of pollution, we think of the 50s and the 60s, but really by the 1880s a lot of raw sewage is leaving New Jersey businesses, factories, homes, Staten Island factories, homes, Brooklyn, and the water is really getting disgusting. In fact, even the ships were contributing to it. The ships that would come across the Atlantic, they would discharge whatever nasty things that they had in their tanks right into the harbor. So we see this pollution getting more and more pronounced, and in the end it is going to greatly affect the oyster industry around Staten Island and in the New York City area. But let's take a look. Let's look at this Mariners Harbor area on Staten Island. It's such a cozy name, Mariners Harbor, and it truly was a Mariners Harbor. In fact, many individuals involved with the marine industry lived along a certain stretch of what we now call Richmond Terrace, and that stretch was known as Captains Row. Historically, it was known as the Shore Road because it was right on the Kilvan Cull. But we'll refer to it as Richmond Terrace just so we can, we can keep our bearings where we want them to be. Captains Row was a little more than a mile, and it actually ran from about John Street in Port Richmond all the way down, all through Mariners Harbor, and just about to a place where what's called Bowman's Brook, used to be called Holland's Hook, probably not too far from where Port Ivory used to be. Well, all along this stretch of road, there were the beautiful oyster boat captains' houses and mansions and things like that. They built these fabulous houses in the 1840s and the 1850s. They loved to have their houses and their mansions on the Richmond Terrace because they could look at the Kilvan Cull. They could see the ships going by. They could see their own ships moored in front of their mansions. They could have the whole marine environment, the activity going on, much the same as Sailor Snug Harbor, where the residents of Sailor Snug Harbor could look at what was going on in the New York Harbor and it'd take them back to their younger years. But these captains, they loved living on the Kilvan Cull and they're in their mansions along Captains Row. They had very difficult jobs, these captains. Not only did they have to go down to Virginia by this point, by the 1850s, 1860s, to get the seed oyster, they also, they had to kind of be daredevils because they really were taking a lot of risk just going back and forth. Storms, you had to depend on your crew. Was it a reliable crew? You had your members of your family as part of your crew. We all know sometimes working with your family how that can go. That's a little joke. And they had to be somewhat gamblers because this was a very risky business. And the seed oyster that they replanted in the Raritan Bay and in the Staten Island Sound, that was a risky business too, because one strong nor'easter or hurricane would just blow up all the sand off the bottom, cover up the oysters as they're growing, and smother them. So, there was a lot of risk involved with this whole adventure. Not to mention that when the oysters were growing, when they'd been planted and they were growing, there was all kinds of marine life that could give the oyster a hard time. There was something called an oyster drill that would actually drill into the oyster shell and then suck out the contents of the oyster, and then the oyster's useless after that. There was something called a boring sponge, and it completely honeycombed the oyster shells, making hundreds of galleries and holes, and that would destroy the oyster too. So, and there were people who went about stealing the oyster shells, and to the oystermen, that was as bad as what, like stealing a horse out in the Old West. And there were some people who stole oysters. I've read that they were shot, much the same as oyster thieves out in horse thieves out in the Old West. Just beyond Nicholas Avenue, at what was 2328 Shore Road, again now Richmond Terrace, we see the home of Captain Israel Johnson. His home, like most of the oyster captains' homes, were done in the Greek Revival style. Tall, fluted columns. Perhaps they had, the pediments in the front of them or on the sides of them. Pilasters. They were a symmetrical shape. They were supposed to be like the old Greek beautiful buildings that you would see in ancient Greece. And these buildings, these Greek Revival buildings, were meant to show that the oystermen were powerful people, strong people, wealthy people, much the same as you see Greek Revival buildings here at Snug Harbor. The people who built Snug Harbor used that architectural style to let the people of Staten Island know that they were powerful, they had money, they were taking care of these sailors. The sailors should be proud that they lived in such a magnificent place. Well, this is what the oyster captains built too. They built these Greek Revival houses, and oh my gosh, they were so stylish. We are fortunate to have pictures of some of them. Mr. William T. Davis, everybody's favorite naturalist and historian, went out and about all over Staten Island, but in the 1920s, he took a series of photographs throughout the island, and within this series, he focused on the mansions of Captains Row here on the North Shore. Now, one of the most interesting captains was Captain George Houseman, no E in Houseman. He had a Greek Revival home at 2380 Richmond Terrace on the east corner of John Street. He was a very important ship's captain, and prior to him, his father was also an oyster boat ship's captain. The Houseman family generally lived in Graniteville, Port Richmond, Mariners Harbor, and he was very, very, very successful, especially during the Civil War. It seems that because the war was going on, they couldn't get oysters from the deep south. So the oysters that they were able to grow or harvest naturally off Staten Island became very, very valuable. So much money was made by people like Captain George Houseman at that time. Mr. Davis and Mr. Lang, they noted, quote, "The captains' houses, for the most part, not only reflected the successful careers of their owners, but similarly the security and enjoyment of their lives at home." Now, you might be familiar with Captain George Houseman, not to get off track, but it was Captain George Houseman's wife, his first wife, Emmeline, and his daughter, Anne Eliza, who were found in a burning building in Christmas night in 1843. Turned out they were both dead. And George's sister, Mary Polly Bodine, was actually, tried 3 times for the murder. But let's get back to the oyster captains. Many of these captains were also involved in farming. They had farms attached to behind their mansions that they had on Richmond Terrace. They were involved in lumber. They had the ships. There was even one captain, a Captain Samuel D. Hart, who used his ship, his oyster ship, to sometimes run a ferry, sort of where the Goethals Bridge is now, over to Elizabeth. So they were a smart group of people. They knew how to make money several ways. Now, back to the mansions. At Wright Street on Richmond Terrace, there was a house belonging to Captain Garrett P. Wright. And he was another very prominent oysterman, built a majestic Greek Revival house. And you know, as you were going down Richmond Terrace by passing Simonson Avenue, you would come to the Lake Croak house. And that house, unfortunately, was torn down in 1920. A lot of the old captains' mansions that we found on Richmond Terrace they went pretty much to rack and ruin over the years, and by the 1960s, some of them were torn down. There is one, I should say, that has survived, and it is the magnificent Captain Stephen Barnes home. And I know you're familiar with this. It's at 2876 Richmond Terrace between Van Pelt and D. Hart Avenue. And not only is it a Greek Revival, but it also has Italianate mixed into the architectural style of this building. It's truly magnificent, and it has survived to this very day. It was built about 1853, and you know, unfortunately, Barnes didn't get a chance to enjoy it very much because he died of pneumonia in 1889. Now, the Barnes mansion at one time actually had a cupola on top. That's one of those square boxes that sits on the top of some of the 1800 structures. And it had very wide eaves under the roof. It had 2 small iron balconies, and it had Gothic finials. Unfortunately, many of those, you know, extras have had to have been removed over the years. But, you know, we're still, as I said, very thrilled that this building is still standing today. And also, it is a New York City landmark. It was designated as such in 1976. So we can rest assured that that building will not be going anywhere. Captain Garrett Post had a house east of Central Avenue at 3260 Richmond Terrace. He was an oysterman for 35 or more years. And it was said, quote, Captain Post kept the pound, and according to a gentleman who knew him as a child, old Captain Post would say, us boys used to drive the stray cows for him on his farm and get 50 cents each. So there's all these interesting little stories about, you know, the captains. And one of the most interesting stories that I came across was the fact that it is believed that sandy ground was greatly influenced indirectly by the captains of Oyster Row. So the ship's captains who went to Virginia to get the seed oyster that they needed to transport back to the waters off Staten Island, some of the news about Staten Island and the happenings and such became knowledge to some of the residents of Maryland. It seems that there were enslaved people in Maryland, and the governor of that state was not happy to have a population of free African Americans in a little town called Snow Hill, Maryland. He was afraid that having these free people would incite those who were enslaved, you know, to have an insurrection. So he asked them to, you know, if they would take free passage, if they would go back to Africa. And of course, that's ridiculous. They've been in America for 200 years. Their ancestors were here. And they sweetened the pot a little, and the governor said, well, we'll give you money. Every family will get X hundred, you know, amount of dollars and to go to Africa. And they were just, this makes no sense. Well, then he and the legislature of Maryland enact a law that for these men of Snow Hill, Maryland, to go out in their oyster skiffs, because they are oyster men, with their own boats, in order for them to earn their living using their oyster boats, they would have to have a white man on board every time they left and went out into the Chesapeake Bay to gather and harvest the oysters. And I mean, that just is ridiculous. So they discussed it with their families, and their families all agreed that this sandy ground that they had heard about in Staten Island, this free settlement of African Americans. Of course, by this time, late 1840s, there's no more enslavement in New York State, so all African Americans are free. But they hear about the sandy ground community. It's a farming community on the island, and they say, why don't we move there? Because they had heard that there were these oyster beds off of Princess Bay in the Raritan Bay, and sandy ground was only about 2 miles from Princess Bay to the shoreline. So various families moved up from Maryland, the Landons, the Purnells, the Bishops, and they moved to sandy ground, built houses, bought land, because they also usually had farms or small farms with their properties. The men would start their day with a 2-mile walk from sandy ground all the way to the Raritan Bay, and then after a whole day of harvesting oysters, they had another 2-mile walk back. So as you can well imagine, it was a hard life. The Bishop family also moved with them from Snow Hill, Maryland, and the Bishop family actually went into blacksmithing. Now, if you recall, I said they used to use the rakes, iron rakes, metal rakes, to rake up the oyster from the bottom. They needed hand tools to crack open the oyster shells, and they had to be made of metal. So the Bishop family became foremost blacksmiths here on Staten Island. Back to the captains of Oyster Row. As I said, you'll recognize some of these names because many of these names are now on the streets that run off of Richmond Terrace. You have Van Names, they were oyster captains. Houseman, as I said, the Lake family, Mercereau family, Wright family, the Dehart family. The Deharts go back to the 1700s, and there are descendants still on Staten Island. They lived at the farthest end of Richmond Terrace. They were an interesting group of people. Captain Samuel Dehart was born on September 8th, 1816, and he grew up with his father, who was an oyster boat captain, and he learned everything there was to know about the oystering business on Staten Island, and he became quite successful. So many of these buildings that these Greek Revival buildings, homes that the captains lived in, as I said, many of them are gone. But some of them have survived. They have been greatly changed, though, greatly altered over the years. And I can give you a little trick, though, to look at. The next time you're on Google Maps or something and you get the satellite view, look at Richmond Terrace. And you can see sometimes the old sloping roofs of the Greek Revival buildings as you're looking down. But if you were on the street to look at them, you would be, say, this is not a Greek Revival building. They've been so far altered. Listen, don't forget to go to noblemaritime.org/now, and you'll get all kinds of information about this wonderful video series that is being created by the Noble Maritime Collection. Thanks. Have a good night.